I just wanted to read a couple of lines from this review by Stephen E. Miller in Global Governance in a review titled Terrifying Thoughts, Power, Order, and Terror After 9/11, to kind of give you a little bit of the context in which this book was chosen. The reviewer writes, 3 new books seek to put recent U.S. policy in a wider context and explain the deeper origins of Washington's reaction to September 11th. John Lewis Gaddis provides the historical context of Bush's post-9/11 grand strategy. Anatole Levin offers a cultural and ideological assessment of the strong nationalist reactions that colored responses to September 11th. And Walter Russell Mead has written a socioeconomic analysis of change in the world and in the United States that are shaping both Washington's challenges and its responses. Collectively, these 3 works leave the impression that the Bush Revolution in U.S. foreign policy is more deeply rooted than many might think or wish to believe. And it reflects the profound social and economic changes whose political effects in the United States are supportive of the Bush worldview. Now, again, it's not our intent to editorialize in the book of the semester, but we thought that Professor Gaddis is clearly someone of great regard in the academic community among historians, particularly those who focus on the Cold War. And this was a very intriguing book that provides an entry point into a very important discussion of America's role in the world. And so to address those questions and to help us in our thinking in preparation for Professor Gaddis' visit in March, we have invited 5 faculty members to participate in a panel, kind of an informal panel setting. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Mark Choate, who's an assistant professor of history at BYU, here on my left, far left. Having started teaching here in late August 2001, he teaches the political and cultural history of modern Europe, colonialism and migration, with research specialties in modern Italian and international history. Professor Choate began his studies at the University of Oklahoma, where he received his Bachelor of Arts magna cum laude and his MA, MPhil, and PhD in history from Yale University. His dissertation on Italian migration and colonialism won Yale's Hans Gratzky Prize in European History. And while at Yale, he attended Professor Gaddis' informal seminar in historical methodology and organized a seminar while Professor Gaddis was away at Oxford. So we have a chance to get into, then, I guess, an autobiographical or a biographical understanding of Professor Gaddis as well as his work. Professor Earl Fry is a professor of political science and endowed professor of Canadian Studies at Brigham University, here on my left. He recently directed BYU's Washington Seminar Program. He served as a Fulbright lecturer at the Sorbonne, the director of international education and Canadian studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, and special assistant in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Montreal, at the École de Haute Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, for someone who doesn't speak Spanish or French, but speaks Portuguese and a little bit of Spanish, and a visiting fellow at the America Society in New York City, the University of Toronto, and McGill University. He also served as the president of the Washington, D.C.-based Association for Canadian Studies in the United States and on the board of directors of the Fulbright Association. Professor Fry's publications are numerous, and they deal with international and regional trade, investment, economic development, and foreign policy issues. Next, here on my right, is Professor Valerie Hudson, professor of political science at Brigham University, who has previously taught at Rutgers and Northwestern. Her specialties include security studies, foreign policy analysis, and gender in international relations. She served as the director of graduate studies here at the Kennedy Center for 8 years and is on the editorial board of Foreign Policy Analysis. Her recent book with Andrea M. Denboer, entitled Bare Branches, Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population, won the Otis Dudley Duncan Award for Best Book in Social Demography and the American Association of Book Publishers Awards for Best Book in Political Science in 2004. Hudson is the recipient of the Carl G. Mazur Award for Excellence in Teaching. And last but not least, on my far right here, Professor Alan F. Keel is professor of German literature in the Department of German and Slavic Languages. He received his PhD in German language and literature from Princeton University and has studied German, French, Greek, Latin, and Russian. He teaches a wide range of courses in German language and literature, including German opera, post-war German women writers, Günter Grass, Rainer Maria Rilke, Group 47 authors, views from the German novel on women's issues, Hermann Hesse, etc., as well as general humanities courses and an annual History of Civilization course with Professor C. Wilford Griggs entitled The Pen and the Sword. as well as several colloquia in the honors programs at BYU. He's also directed several study abroad programs in Austria. He is widely published and developed a 10,000-page concordance of the works of Walter Kempowski, which he uses as the basis for the interpretation of Kempowski's multi-volume German chronicles. He translated Kempowski's best-selling novel Dog Days with colleagues Gerald and Norma Davis, as well as the 55 sonnets to Orpheus and the 10 Duino elegies of Rainer Maria Rilke with poet Leslie Norris. He was named the Honors Professor of the Year in 1992, has received the Abraham O. Smoot Citizenship Award, and a Carl G. Mazur General Education Professorship. Professor Keel is very active on campus, serving in numerous committees and advisory boards, as well as numerous educational and community organizations. And I must also add Professor Andrew Johns, who I just learned is not going to be able to join us. He is an assistant professor of history, received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is taught at USC and Gonzaga, as well as worked in the Office of the Historian at the U.S. Department of State. I'm sorry to say Professor Johns was just at the doctor, and it sounds like he's had some serious problems with one of his knees and may have to require some surgery. So it does sound like he's not going to be able to join us today, but we appreciate his willingness to participate. What we'd like to do is afford each of the faculty members an opportunity to make kind of a statement, including their general observations, dealing with any part of the book or anything dealing with the subject matter. And we'll ask them to keep those statements under 10 minutes each. They're welcome to come up here and use the podium if they like. After each of them has had an opportunity to do that, then we will have a few minutes open to the floor for them to comment on each other's presentations if they'd like, and then we'll move quickly to you for your questions and comments. Again, we're hoping that this will stir up your interest to read the book if you haven't read it, or to finish the book if you're in the middle, and also help you in preparing new ways maybe to think about the book and think about the issues that it raises. I believe faculty are actually seated in the order that we'll proceed, so we'll just start here with Professor Choate, and I will get out of the way.
May I ask, who has already read the book? Okay. It's not very long. Again, it's only 117 pages. You can read it in one sitting. So consider this also a plug for actually reading the book. It starts and ends with autobiographical material from John Gaddis at Yale. And I think that's appropriate for discussing such a big event as September 11th, 2001. So I'm going to follow the same somewhat postmodernist track with some autobiography and biography. As Corey said, I studied at Yale as an undergraduate and graduate, and it's a world that really revolves around New York City. For at least a century, Yale's been a feeder school for New York City, and the Yale Club of New York is the biggest. And many Yale alumni died on September 11th, 2001. So if you can imagine being in basically a suburb of New York, while the center of the World Trade Center, collapses into a heap of rubble, and the plume of smoke can be seen for miles around. And at the start of his book, John talks about his duties as a professor and how he feels that his duty on this day, which I'm sure everyone remembers, is to go about his normal activities, not to be changed in any way by this assault on New York City and Washington, D.C. So he carries on a very academic exercise of an oral exam of one of his students, my friend Hong. And then at the end of the book, he closes with the scene at Yale also. So framing this in the most personal terms of people he knows very well, his friends, his students, and at the end, one of his students volunteers to join the United States Marine Corps. So this is a kind of scene common here at BYU, I think, of students in ROTC or involved in the U.S. military expressing their patriotism. But in some ways, this is much closer to the epicenter of 9/11, much closer to New York City than our experience here. So I first left New Haven in the late summer 2001 and came here. September 11th was in my second year of teaching here on campus. And I was up late the night before writing my lectures, and so I didn't have class on that day, and I was sleeping in, and then my mother-in-law woke me up. Well, she called from her work and woke me up, and so I ran downstairs in time to see the second tower collapsing to the ground. And it's such a shock to see that. I visited the World Trade Center in 1998 in a visit to a consulate, and it seemed so sleek and majestic, standing there against the sky, and then to return years later, and there's just a vast hole in the ground, and then to go to a bookstore, just as I did last week, and pick up a picture book of New York City, and there's not a single picture of the World Trade Center in the whole book. You can see the hole in the site, but there's no record left of this pinnacle of worldwide commerce. And I think that's why John puts this in the most personal terms, because it's as if a part of yourself died that day. And I don't think any of us are the same sense. But the bigger question, of course, was what to do next. And this was very controversial, of course. What course should the United States take, and what should it do? And John Gaddis had actually been thinking about these very issues before September 10th. And in 1999, he created a new course at Yale on grand strategy with Paul Kennedy and Charles Hill. Paul Kennedy, a historian of great power diplomacy from the 19th century and early 20th century. Charles Hill, aide to George Shultz, Republican diplomat, and then John Lewis Gaddis, historian of the Cold War, which had recently ended. And all three of them thought that the United States foreign policy was aimless in the mid to late 1990s, and so they wanted to take the grandest, broadest view of what should be taught in how to think about the past and the future, how to teach grand strategy to students who may grow up to become important leaders in government. And John Gaddis drew upon his experience teaching at the Naval War College in the late 1960s, in which it was taboo to talk about the Vietnam War and debacle. So he and the other instructors instead talked about Thucydides and Clausewitz and events in the ancient and early modern and removed past as a way to get at how to talk about Vietnam. So once they talked about the disasters of the Greek armies, then then the military officers there at the Naval War College could talk about what they'd just gone through in Vietnam. So this grand strategy class formed in 1999 and launched in January 2000 was an exercise in conceptualizing great trends and great direction. And Gaddis's critique of the Clinton diplomacy was its focus on processes rather than ends and goals, and also its reaction to short-term events in the news. Instead of a grand vision, such as Gaddis would say, the United States had in the Cold War, of a great object which will take decades to accomplish, and for which massive resources must be mobilized. So Gaddis, John Gaddis usually spends decades writing his books, but this particular book he put together in a matter of weeks and months. So 5 days after September 11th, he was on a panel on campus at Yale University talking about what had happened, what this means, and what the United States should do. And then these lectures were given just a few months later in New York City, and then this book came out in early 2004. So historians usually don't write about events that are contemporary events that are still happening. But John Gaddis felt that he had something to contribute and something more to say than other scholars were saying at the time. This particular panel in September 2001 had contrary viewpoints, of course. One viewpoint was that the United States had sort of brought the attack upon itself by not engaging with the rest of the world, with its recent diplomacy under the Bush administration. Another critique was the United States had somewhat brought the attack upon itself by not sharing its wealth with the rest of the world. And so this disparity inevitably brought on attacks. Whereas John Gaddis would argue that the United States has real interests to defend and some international rights to carry these out. And he actually casts the Bush administration policy in the fall of 2001 and going into 2003 as an exercise in grand strategy and trying to recast the terms of international relations. And again, this is drawing upon his work in grand strategy and also his work in Cold War history, in which he was a post-revisionist. So that would be coming after the orthodox school of the 1950s that the United States was right in the Cold War and the Soviet Union was wrong and bad. Then the revisionist school to caricature of the 1960s saying that, no, the United States brought the Cold War upon itself by not working together with the Soviet Union. And then Gaddis would be part of the post-revisionist school of distributing some blame on both sides, but generally coming down harder on the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular, based on archival research. So not as politically oriented towards either the left or the right, but a more moderate and more historically based argument. So hope those are points that will invite comment later on. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. The book is very readable. It mixes history with political science and foreign policy. That's a nice little combination. And I'm looking forward to his visit to campus next month. He's well known for his numerous journal articles and books dealing with the Cold War and U.S. foreign policy, and he's a leading academic figure in the field. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I also appreciate his efforts to find historical trends in U.S. foreign policy. Just to give you an idea, he tries to link the events of 1814, the British taking over Washington, D.C., 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and 9/11, 2001, the Al-Qaeda attack on New York City and the Pentagon. He argues that in all three events exposed American territorial vulnerability and resulted in a new grand security strategy characterized by preemption, number one, preemption, number two, unilateralism, and number three, hegemony. The comparisons are fascinating, but only partially accurate. And I'm especially frustrated with his generally positive, although cautious, appraisal of our current policies toward the Middle East. Perhaps his views have changed because, remember, this was written in 2002, and we have about 3 years since then. And this will be something I look forward to discussing with him in a few weeks. It is interesting to note that President Bush also invited Gaddis to the White House to discuss the book and his other writings. And I hope that Gaddis at least expressed some of his cautions about the policy that was being pursued. This would be in sharp contrast to the recent meeting at the White House where all living secretaries of state and defense and national security advisors were invited to the White House to basically discuss the war on terror and the war in Iraq. There was 5 minutes left for these people to actually ask questions or pose their own points of view. It was just simply a photo op. There was 5 minutes of discussion after bringing all these people into the White House, all these decades of experience, and no discussion whatsoever took place. Historically, I would also like to note that Gaddis contends the British sacking of Washington, D.C. in 1814 would lead to manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine on our part. I would argue that manifest destiny was already in play, even though the term would not even be used for several decades later. We should keep in mind that the major reason for fighting the War of 1812 was to take British North America away from Great Britain. British North America we now call Canada. And President Jefferson, Henry Clay in the Senate, they all thought it would be easy to do. And so we would dispatch troops, both regular troops and militia, up to British North America. We would twice seize the capital city of Upper Canada, which was known as York. It's now known as Toronto. And we would do a fair amount of damage there. And in part, this helps to explain the British retaliation of landing in Baltimore and then moving on to Washington, D.C., sending the president running, scurrying away, and actually burning down many of our government edifices. So I believe manifest destiny was already in play, and partly that explains why we were engaged in the War of 1812. This is something which Professor Gaddis overlooks. But above all, I'm discouraged by Gaddis's comparison of Pearl Harbor with 9/11. There is absolutely no proportionality in this comparison. At Pearl Harbor, we were invaded by the Empire of Japan and would soon be engaged in a war not only with Japan but also the Axis powers in Europe. Literally tens of millions of people would perish. If we had not had the atomic bomb and it would have had to invade the island nation of Japan, literally we would have lost hundreds of thousands of our soldiers in that invasion. This was a terrible, terrible conflict. In comparison, the U.S. was attacked by a motley band of 19 fanatics on 9/11 who got lucky after spending literally only a few $100,000, if even that much, on the entire operation. Al-Qaeda at most has a few thousand adherents today and is directed by someone who lives in a cave. The United States took appropriate action in invading Afghanistan after the Taliban government refused to arrest or expel Al-Qaeda from Afghani soil. The U.S. should have concentrated its resources and worked in conjunction with its allies, especially Pakistan, to have finished the job against Al-Qaeda and eliminated Al-Qaeda as a political force. Instead, the Bush administration made a fatal mistake and invaded Iraq rather than getting the job done in Afghanistan. Gaddis explains Iraq as an endeavor to maintain the momentum in this new strategic initiative. I label it as a blunder of the first magnitude, with the U.S. forfeiting any goodwill it had gained as a result of 9/11 among our allies and also among the Middle Eastern nations. because we then invaded and occupied a sovereign nation and attempted to democratize that nation at the point of a bayonet. In addition, the war against al-Qaeda, in many respects, is an effort to win the hearts and minds of Middle Easterners in general, and specifically those who might be tempted to join the terrorist organization. This is basically an exercise in what we would call soft power, not hard power. By invading and occupying Iraq with the initial neoconservative strategy of establishing permanent military bases there and coordinating in part regional policy with Israel, we lost any chance of winning the hearts and minds battle. Instead, we are now widely viewed in the streets of the Arab world as being anti-Arab, totally pro-Israel, anti-Islam, and as the new crusader dedicated to dominating future Middle Eastern politics. In addition, surveys indicate that many people around the world consider the U.S. to be a greater danger to global peace and security than al-Qaeda. How could that have ever happened? Moreover, during the Bush administration, various new words have been introduced in the global lexicon: rendition, secret CIA prisons, waterboarding, detention without resort to legal defense, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. President Bush has also never vetoed a bill during his presidency, even though earmarks are at record levels and cost over $20 billion per year. His last major threat to veto a bill was, ironically, the John McCain-led legislation to outlaw torture as an instrument of U.S. policy. With all these taken together, this represents a major setback in terms of trying to win the war of hearts and minds. In short, Pearl Harbor and 9/11 represented two different worlds requiring far different solutions, and Gaddis has failed to make this distinction. His cautious praise for Bush's Middle Eastern policy is also difficult to understand as an academic, and I hope, again, to have the opportunity to talk to him, because this was written in 2002. Maybe some of his perspectives have changed, and I do look forward to having a conversation with him. Thank you very much.
Delighted to be here. I'm a little hoarse today, so I hope you'll excuse me in advance. I teach national security policy for the political science department, and happily, serendipitously, we are about to talk about grand strategy in the next couple of weeks. So it was actually delightful to be forced to read this book. Not forced, cajoled, persuaded to read this book, which I probably wouldn't have picked up otherwise. Though I will say that I was just happy as a clam to hear that John Lewis Gaddis is coming to BYU. That's just a real coup, and I hope that the students are going to take advantage of this to meet with him and hear him in person. I think that's fantastic, and I congratulate the Kennedy Center for doing that. I am not a historian, and so I cannot pass muster on the historical arguments that are made, as Professor Fry has already commented on perhaps some of the historical inaccuracies. And that ain't me. I can't do it. Maybe Mark will add something later. I'm not sure. But as a political scientist, it was very interesting for me to hear that the problem of derelict states, the problem of failed states, is not new. To be honest with you, maybe as a political scientist who hasn't taken as many history courses as she should, I had not understood that our founding fathers, John Quincy Adams, son of a founding father, actually faced the problem of failed states. I did not comprehend that, and so it was very nice for me to see what Gaddis brought to the table in that regard. To also hear that this issue of failed states had continued on. For example, here's Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. Chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere may force the United States, however reluctantly, to the exercise of an international police power. And then Adams himself, tackling an issue that has been controversial lately. Any effort on our part, that is the U.S.'s part, to reason the world out of a belief that we are ambitious will have no other effect than to convince them that we add to our ambition hypocrisy. Well said. And yet, in bringing the historical argument to the contemporary post-war, post-Cold War, post-9/11 period, I think Gaddis has some important points to make that I'd like to touch upon. And I think I touch upon them perhaps a little more sympathetically than Professor Fry. He says, there is a growing disconnect in our thinking between the security to which we've become accustomed and the means by which we obtained it in the first place. And he follows that on by discussing what he views as a feeling of free security among Americans, the sense that Americans didn't have to work very hard to be safe. I think those are astute observations. I think there is a disconnect between this free security that we've become accustomed to and an acknowledgement of the dirty realities that have led to that security in the first place. And I think it is good that he brings our attention to that. He mentions a couple of things from Adams and then FDR that I'd like to place in counterpoint. He says, Adams suggested that our task is not to reform the world, but to see that we are safe within it. But then FDR asked the question, almost in response to what Adams has said, how can the U.S. be safe in an international system that rewards aggression? Can we also add proliferation? Okay. So there's an interesting, I think, tension there between the realization that the United States is not of infinite means and certainly can create as many blunders and unintended negative consequences as any positive consequences that it creates by its actions. But at the same time, the issue of don't we have a stake in what the international system accepts or tolerates and doesn't tolerate? I think those are at the heart of some of the policy debates that we have today. Gaddis goes on to make the point that one of the reasons our Cold War strategy was so effective, although I could tell him that it was more or less effective depending upon what decade you were looking at, and so there's probably some scope conditions to his overall judgment that our Cold War policy was laudatory and should be emulated even today. But I think one of the points he makes that is well worth taking is that what we haven't had since the Cold War is what he calls, quote, that there should always be something worse than the prospect of American domination. Okay. We've gone without that something worse since arguably 1991, perhaps a little before then. And that in the absence of that something worse, that's where the coalition of the willing, the coalition of consent that he talks about, that sustained the U.S.'s attempted management for the good of the international system, was lost. That consent was lost. Professor Fry alluded to polls talking about how Al-Qaeda is viewed as less of a threat to world stability than the United States. Of course, that too may be an episode whose time is passing. I am certainly no John Lewis Gaddis, but I feel that that situation is changing. And I think it's changing to where, once again, at least European nations are coming to feel that there may, in fact, be something worse than cooperation in American benign hegemony. I think the Netherlands got the first taste of that when Theo van Gogh had his throat slit while riding a bicycle. I think the Danes now know what it's like to be an American in Pakistan. I think things are changing. I think there may come a time in the next several years where Al-Qaeda or Islamic fundamentalism or whatever boogeyman you want to point to begins to outstrip in the polls fears of America. So I believe that what we saw with those polls was an episode whose time came, and I think that time is leaving. Now, that may be too late. Even if we regain the willing consent of perhaps some of our oldest NATO allies, it may well be too late. Okay? And it may be too late in what we might call a demographic sense. Our oldest allies are dying. They're dying out. And there will be new peoples who take their place. And so I'm not sure whether even the regaining of that consent will matter in the long run. We'll just have to see. Gaddis points out, and I would agree with this, that there are times in U.S. history where the American people do not see a contradiction between power and principle. And that it is at those times that America has acted most clearly in ways that support its own interest as well as the stability of the international system. And that somehow, hopefully, we will be able to move to that point again. I'd like to comment, and if John Lewis Gaddis were here, I think this is something on which I would like to engage him, that LDS persons are in a sense uniquely positioned to see that there is no contradiction. After all, we believe that the highest expression of liberty is only to be found in the kingdom of God. And so I think that we are, of perhaps many peoples in the United States, a people capable of seeing that there's not an inherent contradiction there. And that's something perhaps that we can build upon. Gaddis asked questions such as, should we now go abroad in search of monsters to destroy? Which is something that John Quincy Adams actually warned against. America should not go out in search of monsters to destroy. Is democracy the recipe for all? That's a second question that I think is on everyone's mind now. President Bush has so linked the cause of peace with the cause of democracy, and yet we have not seen that come to pass in as clear a manner as would be hoped for. In fact, I'm sure many of you saw the comment by one of the legislators, the Hamas legislators who was recently elected. We thank the U.S. for this weapon of democracy they have handed us. Ouch. Recently, I actually did a correlation. Corey mentioned in his introduction that I'm interested in issues of gender and international relations. So I took the Freedom House Index, which ranks the procedural democracy of nations, and I took indicators that looked at the status of women. And you know what? You don't explain much of the variance in the status of women by looking at democracy. When you have procedural democracy, you can still have states where the human rights of half of the population are abysmal. Case in point, India. So if we're defining democracy solely as the procedures of democracy, then I think we've missed the vision of what democracy is supposed to be about. And there's something more fundamental that is our vision than simply having ballot boxes and people with purple fingers. And that we ought to be thinking about that a little bit more. Gaddis doesn't give you many recommendations at the end of the book. He recommends a new form of federalism at a level lower than that, a more exclusive set of nations than that which comprise the United Nations. This is not a new idea. There have been many who have suggested there ought to be a UN of democracies, where only democracies that fit the bill, whatever that bill may be operationalized as, can join. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure the time is ripe for that. I think that may in fact be premature. And I look forward to the time when Gaddis comes to campus where we can press him. Is there anything more than the short vision he gives us in one paragraph near the end of the book that tells us the way forward from here? And so I hope that we've whetted your appetite somewhat for the arrival of Professor Gaddis on campus, and I will leave you with that. Thank you.
I'm honored to, at least within my own soul, feel like I'm the jester to this eminent court, because as a mere Germanist, I feel in awe of these great social scientists. But I do have one thing to my credit, which is I was one of the original deans of the honors program when the Great Books, or the Book of the Semester program was launched, and along with Jim Curl and some others, Hal Miller. So I take a little credit for that, and I'm glad that the Kennedy Center has taken up this really worthwhile thing. I think Professor Gaddis's little book stands as a warning that even the most intelligent and well-informed human beings tend to shape their views on the basis of certain a priori schemata and prior paradigms, quite naturally sorting and fitting subsequent information into those prior patterns, at least for a time. As new and conflicting information arrives, some never admit their paradigms were flawed, and they continue to try to pound square pegs into manifestly round holes. Even the most scrupulous and honest persons often require a certain time to adjust their paradigms to realities. I think Professor Gaddis is such a scrupulous and honest person, and that he may already have begun to rethink his original view. I've spent some time in the last few days Googling his name and reading interviews with him, more recent than this book. And I could do more of that, but I can't really prove it to you, but I'm looking forward to talking to him and hearing him next month. His original paradigm seems to be that, and as Earl Fry has correctly stated this, I'll summarize this a little more briefly than I was intending to. His original paradigm seems to be that whenever the U.S. is attacked, his sample is admittedly small. He cites only 3 examples: the burning of the Capitol in 1814, Pearl Harbor in 1941, and 9/11 in 2001. American presidencies are then driven, he says, to develop what Gaddis calls the grand strategy. Some of this you've heard already, characterized by unilateralism, preemption, and hegemony. As he teaches a course entitled Grand Strategy at Yale, as you've heard, this is clearly a prior category for him, into which he believed George Bush's war on terror fits. It is certainly true that Bush's response to 9/11 is grandiose, and that it is characterized by unilateralism, preemption, and hegemony. But is it grand? Gaddis anticipates the obvious objection that even history's worst madmen, such as Hitler and Stalin, had something like grandiose strategies. And he allows that a grand strategy, in his sense of the word, must have a positive outcome, not the deaths of tens of millions of innocents and the near destruction of civilization. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it did appear to Gaddis that Bush had a successful and benign strategy, grand strategy in mind. He routed the Taliban out of Afghanistan in short order with very little trouble. My civilization students will appreciate that Gaddis compares Bush favorably with Henry V, who had also been a lazy alcoholic student at Yale. No, Henry wasn't at Yale. And Afghanistan to Henry's lopsided victory at the Battle of Agincourt, with 29 English dead to 10,000 French dead. And it seemed to Gaddis at first that the grand strategy of Bush was working. Since the book was completed, however, and apparently was that in September of 2003, do you think? I was trying to gather that from the interviews that I read online, but...
the lectures were 2002.
Yeah, so they're even more prior than I thought, which is grist for my mill. Since these lectures were given, it has been even more overtaken by events, so to speak. Though it was obvious to others with different paradigms from the beginning that Gaddis was dead wrong about Bush from the beginning. Let me read, for instance, on pages 80 and 81. You can kind of hear the enthusiasm coming through here. This was the situation President Bush confronted before that morning had ended, at the bottom of 80. Any administration in such a crisis would have had to rethink what it thought it knew about security and hence strategy. But this administration has done so in a particularly startling way with striking results. To sense how much so, try a time travel exercise. Place yourself back on that terrible day and ask how you would have responded had someone predicted the following. that the United States would quickly respond by invading and easily conquering the nation any historian would have told you would be the most resistant to invasion and conquest, Afghanistan. Certainly the Russians would have told you that. And it would have had the support of the Afghan people and most of the rest of the world in doing so. That the Bush administration would then, over the next few months, undertake the most fundamental reassessment of American grand strategy in over half a century, and that it would publish the results of this rethinking for all to read, discuss, and dissent from. Then, that it would then, in a manner fully consistent with that strategy, seek the approval of its allies and the United States Security Council for what it regarded as the next logical step, going after Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and that it would fail miserably in getting that approval, that the United States would then nonetheless, with the help of Great Britain, go ahead and attack Iraq anyway in the face of the direst warnings about the risk of military resistance, the use of weapons of mass destruction, the eruption of outrage in the Arab world, the new outbreak of terrorism, a huge increase in the price of oil, and astronomical estimates of the human and material costs of the operation, only to have none of these things happen. That among the things that did happen would be a modest improvement in American and global economic conditions, an intensified dialogue within the Arab world about political reform, a withdrawal of American forces from Saudi Arabia, along with their redeployment to such formerly inhospitable locations as Afghanistan, Iraq, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Romania, and Bulgaria, and an increasing nervousness on the part of the Syrian and Italian governments as they contemplated the consequences of being surrounded by American clients or surrogates. Finally, that much of the rest of the world would find itself amazed and, if truth be told, somewhat alarmed over the emergence of the United States as a more powerful and purposeful actor within the international system than it had been on September 11, 2001, as well as one of the most surprising transformations of an underrated national leader since Prince Hal became Henry V. If anyone had predicted all this on that day, you might have wondered what pills they'd been popping or what we'd then been smoking. It teaches me that you shouldn't write those things, because I'm now inadvertently suggesting, which I didn't mean to do, that John Lewis Gaddis had been smoking something. You almost certainly would not have taken them seriously, and yet this is indeed what's happened. I don't think that's happened at all. I think just the opposite. I think his most dire warnings, the things he puts in there as dire poppycock, and the fact of the things that have happened. That's why I said that I think that this thing has been overtaken by events. Here's what I think a grand strategy would entail, according to my paradigm, which I admit may be flawed. The goodwill that the United States enjoyed on 9/11 and thereafter for a while was enormous. If the Bush administration had not already been set on a course of unilateralism, as exhibited already by its opposition to the World Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court, to the Kyoto Treaty, and to many, many, many other random and almost meaningless examples of its idée fixe about unilateralism, if it had somehow capitalized on that goodwill and in a truly multilateral way, working with such despised entities as the United Nations, and all you have to do is look at John Bolton to see that the Bush administration despises the UN, if it had somehow done even something analogous to what his father had put together as a coalition in the earlier Gulf War, and if a sort of benign use of carrots and very subtle sticks had been employed, and if there had been a kind of grand strategy, then there would have been all kinds of things with which I would have been happily on board. I think disasters in Africa, genocides in places like Rwanda, and starvation in places like Darfur would be top of my list. But I wouldn't even argue with a president who wanted to put a few other things at the top of the list, because I would have thought that if we had been acting nationally, multilaterally, with a kind of peace uppermost in mind, there are so many things in the world that we could have done, so many problems we could have solved. There are so many tyrants we could have eased out without having had a full head-on collision with the Arab world over. The irony of this, of course, is that at the end of the reason the neoconservative hawks like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and Rumsfeld and Cheney and all the others talked Bush into this war in the first place was because of the failure of Bush 1 to finish the job, though he had no UN mandate and certainly no mandate from any of the other allies to have done that. So But it would have been so easy to save the lives of thousands and thousands of Kurds and of marsh Arabs and others in the south if we had simply done slightly different things at the end of the Gulf War. There's no reason why a great head-on collision with that important part of the world had to happen. So I don't have time to lay out my vision for the world for you, but there are things like nuclear proliferation, many, many other things in the world that demand attention, and now we can do nothing about them because we're tied down in a what seems like an endless war in Iraq, and our military is stretched thin, and we've become Vietnam. By the way, if you look in the index of this book, you'll not see Vietnam, nor will you see Israel and the Palestinians. And I think that's an enormous oversight, because if you're going to look at American history and try to examine our position and our political views today on the basis of history, it seems to me that you just can't get past Vietnam, and you simply cannot get past the great, great festering problem that is the Palestinians, that's driving everything from Al-Qaeda on down. And so I don't understand why Gaddis leaves those out. I would have preferred to see something like George Packer's The Assassin's Gate, or Richard Clarke's book Against All Enemies, which I've been reading. I've actually been reading great stacks of books. My mother and dad and my wife are actually concerned about me right now. They think I'm going to go blind. But it's a fine book in the sense that it gets discussion going. Gaddis is a fine man, and I believe that he's going to be softening and maybe coming back from his paradigm. But I have no proof of that, and I'm very interested in talking to him when he gets here. Thank you.
Okay, we'll switch on the microphones and just take a few minutes to go around the panel and see if there are any initial responses to the comments that have been made, and then we'll move to any questions that you might have in the audience. Mark, do you want to just switch them back in? Any comments from the panelists? Go to question.
I'd like to mention, just as a point of interest for those in the audience, that perhaps I didn't make myself clear that I do not believe that the Bush administration are a bunch of idiots. I really don't. And I believe that going into Iraq was not necessarily a blunder. I believe that we'll just have to see how this all plays out in the future. But some of the oversimplified characterizations that I've heard recently, I don't think jive with reality either.
When would you say, at what point would you say one could agree that the war in Iraq was a problem? At what point would one say, or is there such a point that we would ever get to a point where you and I could agree? Would it be a number of deaths, or would it be a number of years? Is there a point at which we could probably both agree that it had been a failure or a success?
I don't believe I are starting from the same page as far as what constitutes a success or failure. For example, you said that all of the dire consequences, all of them have come to pass. But I read his list of dire consequences, and I don't see that they have come to pass. I honestly don't. Furthermore, you say that we've lost the goodwill of the Arab world. We never had it to begin with. We didn't lose anything that we already had. Anything we do will be resented. Anything we do will be resented. And some of the changes that he pointed out, such as the Arab Development Report of 2002, new dialogue within the Islamic world, interesting changes in behavior by Syria, Libya, removal of Syrian troops from Lebanon, the things he points out are true. So I really think that we probably come from different starting points, because I looked at that list and I agreed with Gaddis.
Well, that's why I raised the issue of paradigms, because I really do think that you said different pages. I think we're coming from a different paradigm.
I'd like to chime in too. One issue is the idea versus the execution. So some people reject the idea of fighting in Iraq, and some would say that was a good idea. But the execution is somewhat of a different matter. So, for example, the Abu Ghraib, that was never part of the strategy, at least I hope so, to have this scandal in Abu Ghraib with the overtaxed MPs taking out all their prison guard experience on Iraqi prisoners of war in violation of all sorts of international laws at tremendous cost to the United States, prestige and power, all the soft power you're talking about, Professor Fry. Gaddis is not, I think he's trying to argue for the idea of the strategy of remaking the world rather than waiting for the world to bring its problems to us, to change the states. 2 states failed to send their condolences for 9/11, and that's Afghanistan and Iraq, and neither are with us anymore. And there's also the idea to solve all our problems at once by cutting the funding source for subsidies for suicide bombers' families, and setting up an example of democracy that would hopefully spread from Iraq throughout the world. But the execution was obviously a big problem, not sending in enough troops. So I think we should debate the idea first, and then debate the execution and what actually happened.
Well, let me say just a couple of things. First of all, going into Iraq was wrong. It was absolutely wrong. We shouldn't have done it. The rationale going in, most of the rationale was proved to be false. There were many dictators in the world that we could have gone after. Why go after Saddam instead of others? We'd already had in place since 1991 a no-fly zone where we'd cut off Saddam's access to 1/2 of his country. The Kurds in the north have been free since 1991. Parts of the Shia have been free in the south since 1991. And through Operation Desert Fox, which was taken under the command of Clinton, we went in and took out more of his critical facilities. We were weakening Saddam more and more as long as that no-fly zone was in place. Again, run by the Americans and the British. It cost us $3 billion a year, which is now costing us in 3 weeks in Iraq. $3 billion per year. We never lost one pilot. We were in the process of weakening Saddam as years passed. There was absolutely no reason why we should have gone in. Once we went in and entered the nation-building phase, it's been a catastrophe. During the 2000 campaign, Bush said, "I will avoid nation-building at all costs." And he got involved about as deeply as you could in Iraq and trying to be engaged in nation building. So I guess what I'm saying, and I think you're right in differentiating, 1, we should never invaded Iraq. 2, the nation building phase has been very costly. At the end of this year, it will have cost us $400 billion. It will cost us already now 2,300 American lives, 32,000 Iraqi lives. By the end of the day, depending on how long we stay, according to Professor Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Nobel Prize winner in economics, he says it's going to cost us $1 trillion to $2 trillion. Because we're going to have a lot of soldiers coming home. A lot of them are already wounded, and they have life-altering. This is about 16,000. A lot of them with life-altering injuries. And plus them, we're going to have to put up with the post-traumatic syndrome, all the costs there, and it's literally going to cost us about $1 trillion or $2 trillion. So I guess if I'm asking Valerie and saying, well, how about the opportunity costs? What have we given up? Instead of going in Iraq, what could we have done? And my argument, of course, is that we should have never gone in. We could have saved that $1 trillion or $2 trillion. We could have saved those American lives. We could have been doing something differently. Her argument would be, well, maybe it was worth the cost. That we don't know yet. Maybe there'll be a democratic government at the end of the day. We'll be able to get out peacefully, and democracy will spread throughout the Middle East. That's what the neoconservatives say. And maybe at the end of the day, they will be right. I am very dubious that that will be the case.
Our audience is just diminished. The recording continues, so open it up for questions. Questions from the audience?
Just want to ask Professor Fry, you said that you believe that entering Iraq was wrong because the reasons given were proved false. So do you believe that people who gave those reasons were lying to us or just simply had it wrong? And if they hadn't proved false, would it have been right?
We know that from the book by Bob Woodward that the president began planning to invade Iraq in November of 2001. And we would invade in March of 2003. We know that in the meeting that took place in the White House at the end of January of 2003 with Tony Blair and a few advisors, that the president said, I need to come with better explanation of why we should invade to convince the American people. He said he didn't have it yet. He was hoping someone would finally step forward, a defector, and say there is WMD, and particularly, using nuclear bombs and having the delivery system. That was never there. He also said during the meeting with Tony Blair, if necessary, I'm willing to take a U-2 plane. I'm going to paint it in the colors of the United Nations. I'm going to fly it low. I'm going to try to convince Saddam to shoot it down because that would be a violation of UN rules. I mean, he was grasping at straws. And, finally, at the end of the day, when nothing else really came to fruition, he said, well, we got rid of a bitter dictator. Really, and he was a very brutal dictator, no doubt about that. And hopefully what we're doing in Iraq will lead to the spread of democracy to other parts of the Middle East. I just think that the price was much too high to have done that. And we had other alternatives. As I said, the no-fly zone was working. And we were slowly degrading the capability of Saddam, and hopefully to the point where his own people would rise up. And, he was much weaker militarily in 2003 than in 1991.
It was the failure of the Clinton administration's policy toward Iraq that brought us to this point. The no-fly zone was fine over Kurdistan, although it did not prevent the Anfal. But what was happening to Shiites in the south was continued brutality, because the no-fly zone did not prevent troop incursions, the draining of the marshes, the execution of many of people. Not only that, we were not hurting Saddam. We were hurting his people. We chose what we considered the more benevolent route of sanctions. And what we discovered was that we created a horrible humanitarian disaster for the innocents while strengthening the rule of a dictatorship. It was the failure of the Clinton administration that I believe led to this final showdown.
Can I weigh in with just a footnote on what you said? I don't know. You can probably hear me okay. I have a loud voice. Just a footnote to what Earl said in response to your question. The claims about WMDs are, I'm convinced that even the intelligence agencies didn't know. They thought it's possible because Saddam, there was a strange game that some of his scientists were telling him falsehoods. He was telling falsehoods back to them and to the world, and nobody was quite sure about that. But one thing that is really pretty clear, where deception and I think duplicity were involved, was the claim that Saddam was supporting al-Qaeda. And there's the great actor is Dick Cheney. And he kept insisting on this even after it had been very, very resoundingly disproven. And then there were other things like the claims about Saddam buying yellow cake from Niger, which has led to the Valerie plane thing, which is still kind of going on, I think, somewhere below the surface. So I think if you take all of the reasons that Bush went in, the biggest one, the weapons of mass destruction, even if you give him that one, all the rest of them were pretty shaky, to say the very least. And in response to Valerie, I mean, I appreciate the problems of trying to contain him, and the infant mortality rate went soaring in Iraq. It was a terrible calamity. But remember who didn't finish the war in the first place? It wasn't Clinton. I mean, though Clinton has his share of blame, but it was George Bush Sr. who ended the Gulf War in a ragged way. And it was Arnold Schwarzkopf who said to the Iraqi generals when they asked him if they could fly helicopters, they said, well, sure, why not? There was no U.S. thought given to that. There was no statement from the part of the State Department. He said, sure, you can fly helicopters. And the guy said, what if they're armed helicopters? He said, don't bother me with this detail. And so that led to the putting down of these horrible uprisings on George Herbert Walker's watch. And it was only when Secretary of State Baker saw this disaster in Kurdistan, or in the north, that he said, we've got to break some China and get something done here to protect these people, because this is a humanitarian disaster. That finally the no-fly zones were instituted. But it should have been done better earlier than that. And it's true that Clinton's interventions were sporadic, but you've got to remember that Clinton had no backing from the United States public to do this kind of thing. There was no smoking gun. There was no outcry against Saddam. And tragically, he was tied down by Monica at that time, too. So you have these terrible, terrible events conspiring to leave us in a terrible position. But, if you look at the disasters that have happened to Iraqi civilians since we invaded, it breaks your heart. And to see what's happened to American soldiers. The concept of polytrauma, which is a brand new word, which happens when the improvised explosive devices go off. These kids are having, their eyeballs are fractured. They're being blown in. They're being covered with infectious dirt. The dirt and other stuff is blown into their bodies. Their skulls are shattered. They're horribly burned. Their limbs are ripped off. And yet, because we have such good medical care now for them, 90% of them are being saved. That's why, as Earl says, we have such an enormous burden now of these very, very severely wounded men and women on our side coming back, which are going to be a burden on us forever. And if you've ever had any dealings with the Veterans Administration medical system, you'll know that this is going to be a huge problem for them and for the nation the rest of the time. If you balance out these calamities and these tragedies, and it's truly a choice of terrible evils, I have to say that it's already beginning for me to tip over into the other direction. Not that we would be better off with Saddam, but there clearly had to be other ways of getting rid of him besides this nuclear option that we chose.
I'll chime in, too, for your question. The United States took on certain responsibilities in December 1990, and with the first Gulf War to Iraq, that were not executed upon, that were not fulfilled. So the United States invades with this broad coalition, everyone in the world's support, basically, except for Iraq. But they're not able to do anything decisive. They're not able to overthrow Saddam, since there's no support for that. The United States can't attack Baghdad or do any changes. And so we leave the country in shambles for a decade, just falling apart under UN sanctions, under U.S. leadership. And so that was the better reason to go back to Iraq, was we had made a mess of it, and just walking away is not the right thing to do. That what kind of strategic big idea message is that? And Saddam was supporting terrorism and Al-Qaeda. Zarqawi was there before. Zarqawi is there still. He's still there. Al-Qaeda is using this as a massive platform in the current disorder and chaos in Iraq. The tragedy is that the good idea of going in and Iraq will fall over and everyone will be happy and everything will be democratic right away was not realistic at all. And another plug for Gaddis's book, on page 102 to 103. The raggedness with which the United States military forces ran the initial occupation contrasted strikingly with their efficiency in invading that country. Consolidation obviously had not been a planning priority. Well, that's an understatement. There was no plan at all for what Iraq would be like once the government were toppled. But But some of these issues come back to 1991, definitely, and what the United States was after when it liberated Kuwait and attacked Iraq in the first place.
Question.
My question is, recently Iran has been threatening again to work on developing nuclear weapons, and it seems like, having gone into Iraq, they're hedging their bets that we won't compound the error by going, or compound the mess. I won't say whether it's an error or not, but that's definite. The mess by going to Iran. How does that affect? I mean, the world seems to be a less safer place to me if Iran can get away with developing nuclear weapons because our hands are tied because of what's happening in Iraq.
Iran would have gotten away with it anyway. Absolutely. As would North Korea. There was no way that the invasion of Iraq has eclipsed some potential to deal more forcibly with Iran and North Korea than we're prepared to do so. The two military situations are very difficult, and it would be almost impossible for the U.S. to take on either country in a land battle.
A related question I have about that is, Dr. Hudson said that we never had the goodwill of the Arabs, and that reminds me of the Cold War and Stalin. It seemed that we decided we wouldn't make overtures to Stalin because they needed an enemy. Stalin needed an enemy with which he could build his dictatorship around. If we assume that the Arabs would paint us an enemy no matter what we do, what does that mean in terms of is that how Bush is acting, is deciding his policy?
Well, I think that Valerie's too negative when it comes. She paints the Arab world with one fine brush. I mean, we had many allies among the Arabs in 1990 and 1991. Now, you might say it was just an alliance of opportunity to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. They paid most of our bill, by the way, for fighting that war. We have good friends in the Arab. We've had good friends in Jordan for a long time, and so maybe you could say we can't trust the Arabs, but I think that's too simplistic. In terms of Iran, I also disagree with her somewhat because, well, we do think we have 5 to 10 years before they would actually have a weapon in place and have a delivery system in place, so it gives us time. We probably could use both our missile capability and our air capability to take out facilities as the Israelis did in Iraq in 81. But it would be more difficult, there's no doubt, because they've hidden it better. But one of the problems that we faced is that we have expended our Army and our Marine forces. You know, we haven't added. Congress gave authorization for 30,000 new troops because we have many of our ground forces that are in their second or third tours already in Iraq. They're really they're getting tired. They're getting fatigued. And the Bush administration said we're not going to add the 30,000 new troops. Instead, we're going to push for 2 new destroyers instead of the troops. And so in effect, if we did launch an attack against Iran, we know that many of the Shia are very close to Iran. Al-Sadr himself has said that if the United States attacks Iran, that his forces would attack the United States in Iraq. And so we've complicated it. And maybe Valerie's right. We couldn't have done much anyway. We probably would not have wanted to go in ground forces anyway in Iran. That's different than Iraq. We could have used, again, air forces if necessary and the missile capability. But what we've done in Iraq is basically limited our options that much more in terms of what we can do, and whether it be in Iran or other parts of the Middle East, because we've expended what we have in terms of our ground forces. We do have the air capability, the naval capability still in place, but you can only use that under certain circumstances.
Yeah, you can't limit an option you didn't have. Both the North Koreans and the Iranians paid very close attention, not only to what's happened since 2003, but what happened after the Iraq strike. And these facilities were decentralized, they were buried, they were hardened. I have friends in the intelligence community who say that we do not know where all the facilities in Iran are, and we certainly don't know where all the facilities in North Korea are. And I think it's also fair to say that it's very important to distinguish between friendly regimes and friendly populaces in the Middle East. The Jordanian populace is not pro-American, no matter how many times King Abdullah visits the United States. If you were to poll the Jordanians, you would not find a friendly attitude towards the United States, and you would not have found one even under King Hussein, his father. So I think that's an important distinction to make.
So are you saying that Arabs are habitually anti-American?
No, that would be a real straw man argument, wouldn't it? I would say that the grievances are long-standing, and that what has happened has only aggravated existing grievances and not created a whole new category of grievances that didn't exist before.
But do you believe there are some root causes to that animosity in the streets of the Arab world?
Well, what's a root cause?
Well, think about it. What might be? Could it be maybe the problem between Palestinians and Israelis would be one that might obviously cloud their judgment towards the United States or have some impact upon their judgment?
I don't think their judgment is clouded. I believe if I were a Jordanian, I'd feel exactly the same way. I don't think there's any PR campaign possible that would turn that situation around.
I agree with you there.
Yes.
Is it possible to make a comment rather than to ask a question?
Sure.
We do that all the time. That's the way academics work.
I've been stimulated by this panel and irritated at times. But just one comment, Earl. I saw Bob Woodward's comments in his book, or his statements in his book about the planning that went into to the Iraq War quite differently than you did. But then, when I'm blind, I have to rely upon my ears, and sometimes I may not hear what I don't want to hear. But I did see it differently. Alan, hindsight is a wonderful thing. War is never good, except in a defensive way.
I agree.
And I would see, I think, the decision making and the information that we had, granted, perhaps not correct in all instances, I would see it quite differently. And now a very biased opinion. I think that the panelists have maybe too much stated the political viewpoint more than an objective one. But are we not all subject to that to a certain extent?
Let me respond just a little bit. It's good to see you, Mel. In terms of my comment about Woodward, Woodward's basically pretty positive. All I said about that was that in November 2001, Woodward says Bush asked to begin the planning to invade Iraq. It wasn't that he had to do it, but that was the option that was on the table. But the main thing...
We want to, don't we? I mean, if I wanted, I didn't mean to have not evaluated or to have heard correctly what you said.
Okay. I think that the one thing I would like to just add in terms of putting everything in context and maybe getting where I'm coming from, General Schwarzkopf, who was in charge of our troops in '91, has said this. He said, war is a profane thing, and anybody who says they're not afraid of war is either a liar or they're crazy. Then he said within that context, when Schwarzkopf stated that when the civilian leadership ordered him into war, this is 1991, he told his troops to go out and not attack, nor damage, nor surround the Iraqi troops, but rather to utterly destroy the Iraqi forces. This is war in its most brutal context. And I guess my point is, if we're going to put our young men and women in harm's way, we better have a good reason to do it, because our young men and women in uniform are not mercenaries. These are people that they're there to defend the United States of America. And if we're going to put them in harm's way, we better have a good rationale. My argument is the invasion of Iraq was not good enough. Of course, people can disagree with that.
Any final comments?
I wanted to respond to Valerie's question about the historical accuracy or basis for the book, and Andy Johns was going to comment upon this, and he, when giving his apologies for not coming, summed up saying that that the accuracy is not in question, but Gaddis uses Adams and FDR somewhat as symbols. I mean, they said more than just those quotations. So most of the historical controversy is over what else Adams said in his later career, rather than rather than directly attacking Gaddis's argument, more a question of emphasis and tone, and especially on the continuities or discontinuities in American history.
When we get to the point where we have as many Kennedy employees in the room as audience members, I think we've entered a C-SPAN moment. But I was reminded when we had an ambassador here recently who remarked that any group over 10 was impressive to him. So in Washington, D.C. terms, we've succeeded. I also would close with the comment that as I was reading some of the interviews and commentaries and articles that Gaddis has given, and a number of those are linked on the Book of the Semester website, so I'd point you to those as well as Google as well. There was one in my mind where Professor Gaddis said he'd given a speech based on his book at Harvard University, and he said an eminent professor whose name you will all recognize stood up and made the comment afterward that it was a brilliant book and a wonderful speech, and I don't think there was a single thing I agreed with. So I think I'd like to thank the panel for being provocative and not pulling any punches, and really I think being honest and forthright. I think we've really gained a lot from that, and we truly are excited about the visit of Professor Gaddis and look to your participation and attendance at that time. So thanks a lot.
What time will that be? Do you know?
3 o'clock. 3 p.m. on Wednesday the 15th in the Joseph Smith Building Auditorium. So let's thank the panel. Remaining